Good to see you again. This film is quite literally the first ever horror film, as it defined what was to become a new genre. It has fabulous sets and a wonderful central character played by an actor who delivered what many consider a benchmark performance that would influence future actors and filmmakers. It is Dracula from 1931. Bram Stoker's novel had been used without permission as the story for Nosferatu in 1922 by German expressionist filmmaker F.W. Murnau. Stoker's widow successfully sued for plagiarism and copyright infringement, with the court ordering all prints of the film destroyed. Thankfully, the film survives. The original Broadway production of Dracula, also adapted from Stoker's novel, starred Bela Lugosi and opened at the Fulton Theatre on October 5, 1927. It ran for 261 performances before touring the country. This is when Universal began expressing interest in the script, with production head Carl Laemmle Jr. seeing the story's box office potential. He wanted Dracula to be a spectacle on the scale of The Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923 and The Phantom of the Opera from 1925. However, after the stock market crash and the beginning of the Depression, Universal chose not to risk such a large investment. The novel had too many characters and was far too convoluted, so the script was instead adapted from the much less expensive Hamilton Dean stage play. Interestingly, later versions of the play were influenced by the film. Dracula's line, "I do not drink wine," was not in the play but was later added to please audiences who expected to hear it. When Todd Browning was attached as director, he had a solid reputation in silent film behind him, but like many others, he was struggling with the transition to sound. This was exacerbated by the recent loss of friend and collaborator Lon Chaney, which left him morose and struggling with alcoholism. Lon Chaney was originally considered for the title role, and casting someone else proved problematic. Laemmle was not interested in Lugosi in spite of good reviews for his stage performance. He instead considered others including Paul Muni, Chester Morris, Ian Keith, John Ray, Conrad Veidt, Joseph Schildkraut, Arthur Edmund Carew, and William Courtenay. Before being cast, Bela Lugosi acted as an unpaid intermediary for Universal Pictures in rights negotiations with Mrs. Stoker, and that resulted in her lowering the price from $200,000 to $60,000. Eventually, Universal acquired the rights, including the plays from the play's writer Hamilton Dean, for $40,000. Lugosi was so eager for the role that he agreed to $500 per week for a 7-week shoot, a paltry sum even during the Depression. This and his efforts as a negotiator secured him the part. Todd Browning knew Lugosi as they'd collaborated on the film The 13th Chair in 1929. Bette Davis, who was contracted to Universal at the time, was considered for the part of Mina Harker. However, Laemmle thought that she lacked the necessary sex appeal. Todd Browning had seen Helen Chandler in 1928 on Broadway and thought she was a good choice for Mina. Helen wasn't interested in the film but took the role anyway, and it became her most famous. After the film's success, Chandler had a brief period of success, but by the late 1930s roles had dried up and she was often hospitalised due to her alcoholism. Dwight Frye was cast as Renfield, a role that typecast him and restricted him to playing eccentric, jittery characters with a manic edge or criminal lunatic types. During development, the screenwriters had carefully studied and were inspired by Murnau's Nosferatu. They lifted a nearly identical scene that does not appear in Stoker's novel. At the Count's castle, Renfield accidentally pricks his finger and it starts to bleed. Dracula creeps forward, only to be repelled when a crucifix falls in front of the bleeding finger. On September 29 of 1930, Dracula began shooting at Universal City with a $355,000 budget and on a 36-day shooting schedule. According to numerous accounts, the production was disorganised and Todd Browning showed little interest in directing the film. The normally meticulous Browning was said to have been sullen and unprofessional during the shoot, often leaving cinematographer Carl Freund to take over, making Freund something of an uncredited director. Browning would recklessly tear pages out of the script if he felt them to be redundant. None of the cast members took filming seriously, except for Bela Lugosi, who would stroll up and down the set with his cloak wrapped around him saying, "I am Dracula." This was Bela's method for honing his concentration, staying in character and enhancing his performance. Lugosi was a classically trained Hungarian actor and a staunch professional who cared deeply about his craft. The film opens on Walpurgis Night, which is April 30, when the witches celebrated a Sabbath and evil powers are at their strongest. A number of creatures roamed to Dracula's castle, among them armadillos. The animal was mistakenly believed to dig its way into coffins and eat the cadavers because they were occasionally seen digging in graveyards. The peasants at the beginning of the film are praying in Hungarian, and the signs in the village are also in Hungarian. When Bram Stoker wrote the original novel, the Borgo Pass in Transylvania was then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, making both the villagers scene and Lugosi's casting very appropriate. Dracula never once blinks, an effect that enhances the undead character's otherworldly aura. And this is enhanced by Bela's famous menacing stare. Cinematographer Carl Freund achieved this effect by aiming 2 pencil spotlights into Lugosi's eyes. Some of the original prints of the film were tinted green to give it a more eerie look. The film has no real musical soundtrack, in part due to the costs involved, but also because it was believed that with the audience being new to sound on film, they would not accept hearing music for which there was no on-screen explanation. The large, expensive sets for the Transylvania Castle and Carfax Abbey sequence remained standing after filming was completed and were used by Universal for many other movies for over a decade. The spiderwebs in Dracula's castle were created by shooting rubber cement from a rotary gun. During production, the studio made a number of demands, including shooting the film in sequence to cut costs, shooting a Spanish language version overnight on the same set with Spanish-speaking actors to save money on its European release, and not filming the scene when Dracula attacks Renfield due to the perceived gay subtext. A memo was sent to the director stating Dracula is only to attack women. After viewing the initial cut, Carl Laemmle reportedly said that the film gave him the heebie-jeebies and ordered that it be re-edited. Browning was bitterly disappointed, claiming that his best work ended up on the cutting room floor. When the film premiered at the Roxy Theatre in New York City on February 12, 1931, newspapers reported that audience members fainted in shock. This publicity piqued people's curiosity, and within 48 hours, 50,000 tickets had been sold, setting up the film's $700,000 profit, making it the 6th most popular movie at the US box office of that year and the largest of Universal's 1931 releases. The film was 85 minutes long on its initial release, but when reissued in 1936, cuts were made to meet the production code. The most significant cut was an epilogue that was removed out of fear of encouraging a belief in the supernatural. That sequence is now assumed lost. Also removed was Renfield's scream as he is being killed and Dracula's moan as the stake is driven through his heart. These 2 audio deletions have been restored on recent re-releases. The film met with mixed reactions upon its release in Hungary, Lugosi's home country. Critics already considered Dracula adaptations to be old hat and singled out Bela's performance as the worst part of the movie. According to contemporary newspaper articles, audiences would loudly mock the film, causing the entire theatre to periodically erupt into laughter. Lugosi's Dracula eventually became part of public consciousness in Hungary, even though the film itself was mostly forgotten for several decades. The critical reception was generally good. The New York Times called it the best of the many mystery films, describing Browning's direction as imaginative and Helen Chandler's performance as excellent. Variety praised the film for its remarkably effective background of creepy atmosphere and wrote, "It's difficult to think of anybody who could quite match the performance of Bela Lugosi." Film Daily declared the film a fine melodrama and remarked that Lugosi had created one of the most unique and powerful roles of the screen. In addition to the Spanish language version, a 3rd silent version of the film was also released. In 1931, some theatres had not yet been wired for sound, and during this transition period that many studios released alternative silent versions with intertitles. After the commercial and critical success of Dracula, Universal released Frankenstein later the same year and would lead the way into the horror genre with The Mummy in 1932, The Invisible Man in 1933, Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, and The Wolfman in 1941. Universal released Dracula's Daughter in 1936, a sequel that starts immediately after the end of this film. A second sequel, Son of Dracula, in 1942 starred Lon Chaney Jr. The count returned in 3 more Universal films, House of Frankenstein in 1944, House of Dracula in 1945, and the comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, which is the only other time Lugosi would play Dracula on screen. Dracula has now become widely regarded as a classic of the era and of its genre. To many film lovers and critics alike, Lugosi's portrayal is regarded as the definitive Dracula. Gary Oldman, who played Dracula in Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation, considered Lugosi to be his favourite Dracula. In 1998, composer Philip Glass was commissioned to compose a musical score for the film. Universal's DVD releases allow the viewer to choose between the unscored soundtrack or the Glass score. And Glass and his Kronos Quartet also performed live during showings of the film in 1999, 2000 and 2017. In 1999, film critic Roger Ebert praised Lugosi's performance and Freund's cinematography. He noted the film's lasting influence and included it in his list of great movies. Angie Arrigo of Empire magazine called Lugosi's performance the Dracula against which all others are measured, adding that the film has wonderful, unforgettable moments. John Oliver of the British Film Institute credited the movie with establishing the popular on-screen image of the vampire and establishing the horror genre. For him, the virtues of its star performance and general visual style outweigh other deficits that the film might have. This is another of the 1001 movies you must see before you die. In 2000, both the English and Spanish language versions were preserved in the US National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. So what's good reasons to watch this particular film? Story, it's a classic obviously, beautifully shot on really great sets, and a wonderful performance by Bela Lugosi. It's a Dracula story, it's really the greatest movie monster of all time. So what I suggest you do is you go to our website, find our virtual screenings page, find the link to this particular film there, click on it and watch it, see what you think, and as always we'd invite you to come back, let others know what you think about this particular film and whether you'd recommend it for them. And then we'll see you back again in the not too distant future for our next classic films review. Catch you next time.